This is the Canon R3 and the Canon R5. These are two of the best mirrorless cameras that Canon makes. Now, if you're trying to decide which one of these cameras to get, then you're probably a professional photographer, videographer, content creator making money off of this, because these are not cheap. At the time of this recording, the R5 comes in at around $3,500 and the R3 comes in around $5,000. Now, if you're going back and forth between these two cameras, there's a few key differences you should know about. Now, the most obvious difference is its size. The R3 is a lot bigger and heavier. Now, along with its bigger size, the R3 also comes with an extra grip as well as customizable buttons and Canon's bigger, longer lasting batteries, the same ones they use in the 1DX. They both have dual SD card slots that feature one SD card and one CF Express card. Now, I understand why cameras like this really need a faster CF Express card because they're professional grade bodies. But what I don't understand is why there's an SD card slot with the CF Express card slot. Now, if you're dual recording or continuous recording, which is the whole purpose of having two card slots, it's always going to be limited to the slower card, which in most cases is going to be the regular SD card. So I do wish that these cameras came with two of the same card slots, but having that CF Express is really nice, especially when you're needing a faster card to shoot certain projects. Now, the next big difference is the megapixel count. The R3 comes in at 24 megapixels, while the R5 comes in at 45. Now, this is a case scenario where bigger is definitely not better when it comes to megapixel count. Now, I've always said that I prefer a camera between 20 and 30 megapixels just because it avoids all those unnecessary large files that come with a higher megapixel camera. Now, unless you're cropping photos a significant amount or printing them up to a billboard size photo, you really don't need that high megapixel count. All of my prints, including the one behind me and the ones on my wall, are all shot with cameras that are in that sweet spot of 20 to 30 megapixels. There's also low light capabilities and ISO ranges to consider when looking at both of these cameras. So I did a quick test just to see how well these perform and how the image quality varies at different ISO levels in low light conditions. The results may surprise you. So here I have a few watches. They're all different dials, different faces, different bezels. So I took a few close-up photos of these just to test out the ISO capabilities in photographing these watches. Let's jump into the test. Here we have the two images side by side. The one on the right here is the R5 and the one on the left here is the R3. Now, this is at 100 ISO. And at 100 ISO, you won't notice any major difference between the two. Now, you might see a few differences in where the camera focused, but other than that, there's pretty much no noise in both of these images. So you'll be able to see that the image quality on both of these is very good. Now let's jump into 800 ISO. So at 800, it's pretty much the same thing. There's almost no noise in the image, very good image quality, and bumping up to 800 has not negatively affected the image at all. Now let's jump into 1600 ISO. This is where you see some very minimal noise start to form in the R5. If you look at the R3, it is handling it a little bit better, but again, the image quality is pretty good on both of these cameras. If you want to nitpick, you can say that the noise is being introduced a little bit earlier here on the R5, but they both handle very good, and with some light editing, this will definitely pass as a high quality image. Now let's jump into 3200 ISO. When it comes to this is when you finally start to see some noticeable noise, a little bit more than 1600. If you zoom in, you might start to see it in some of your images, but these sensors have gotten so good that with some light denoise and some light editing in Lightroom, you won't really be able to tell. And so 32, anything higher than that is probably when you start to see more really noticeable noise. Now let's jump into some higher 6400 ISO. These details are starting to be lost more in the R5 on the right compared to the R3 on the left. If you notice the dark parts of the bezel here starting to be a little bit more gray, it's starting to lose its detail, and the R5 is starting to lose image quality pretty heavily over the R3, especially in 6400 ISO. Now let's jump into 12800 ISO. Now this right here is my limit. I never go past this, and I try not to even get here. But this is where you start to see the image really start to break down. And it's especially noticeable here on this dial with the squares, as well as the bezel here on the watch on the left. Now the watch in the middle, the Tissot, you can notice that the squares are starting to fade, and some of these you can't even see that they're squares anymore. When you look over on the R3, however, you can still count the squares and they're pretty noticeable. The detail is not lost. It's still retained at 12,800 ISO, which is a huge difference. Now, if you are pushing your cameras pretty heavily, then this is when the R3 really does shine. If you're shooting in conditions where there's absolutely no light, the R3 will definitely be able to hold up its detail and its image quality. Now let's go to 25,600 ISO. Now this is when both cameras kind of fall apart when it comes to the image quality, when it comes to the detail. There's some pretty extensive noise here in the blacks. When you look at the dial, when you look at the numbers where it says 60, 20, the detail is lost in both of these, but it is significantly more on the R5 here on the right. The R5 is not doing well when you really start to push it to its limit. Now just for fun, let's go to 51,000 ISO. If you notice here on the R5, at this point it looks like a smooth dial. You can't even notice that there's a pattern on this dial. The bezel here on the right, you can't even really tell that it was black. It looks more of a gray. Just all the detail, all the blacks are just completely gone when it comes to this image. If you look over here on the left, when it comes to the R3, you can kind of still see this detail, which is huge, but neither of these images are something that you would want to work with or you would want to deliver to a client. It would take some pretty heavy processing to recover both of these images. Now, ISO performance is a huge difference in these two cameras. I didn't think it would be that much of a difference, but you can really tell that in those extremely high ISO scenarios, the R3 just performs significantly better. Now, I don't know how much of that has to do with its lower megapixel count and how much of that has to do with its better sensor in general. But that makes you think there might even be a case for the R6 Mark II, which actually has the same sensor as the more expensive R3. Now, I have made a few videos on the R6 and the R6 Mark II, so if you want to check that out, check the links in the description. I'll leave that below. Now, aside from the megapixel count and the ISO capabilities, speed is a big difference when it comes to these two cameras. The R3 is more geared toward faster wildlife, sports photography, and is built in a way where it will last in any condition. So if you shoot in positions where you need that speed, and you need that durability, it might be worth spending the extra on the R3. Now let's talk about the overheating. This has been the main topic of pretty much every Canon camera that's come out recently, but it's not even something to consider when it comes to the R3. I've never seen, heard, or experienced anything remotely close to overheating when it does come to the R3. The R5, however, is different when it comes to the overheating. Now, when the R5 first came out, the overheating was the biggest issue that anybody could talk about. Now, since then, Canon has done a very good job in releasing multiple firmware updates to fix this overheating issue. At this point, overheating is very minimal, if not there at all. Now, the only time you might experience overheating at this point with the R5 is if you're shooting a documentary, something that's 4K or 8K, and you're shooting non-stop all day. After the firmware updates, it really does take a lot for the R5 to get to overheating. I've been able to shoot clips of 4K 60 pretty much all day with no problems at all. So at the end of the day, is the R3 really worth $2,000 more than the R5? Probably not. Now, if you're shooting sports or wildlife and you really need that extra speed and you're being compensated well for it, then it's something to consider. Now, the only way it really makes sense is if you're pushing a camera like the R5 to its absolute limits, which most people are not. If you're shooting at extremely high ISO levels, which you probably shouldn't be anyway, or if you need a significantly faster shutter, which most people don't. Or if you're shooting extended 4K and 8K videos, which in that case, you might be better going for a cinema camera. In most scenarios, for the majority of people, the R5 does everything and it's even overkill. But if you have the money to spend and you don't want to worry about a single thing every time you pick up the camera, the R3 is not a bad option. Hopefully that helped you make a decision on these two cameras and you learned something. If you have any more questions, leave it down in the comments below. If you want to check out the R3 or the R5 or any of the other gear I use, I have links in the description below. And to the 5 people still watching, I'll see you next time.